So yes, like Rita said, thank you so much. So my name is Miguel Amigot, and I'm the CTO of a family-owned generative AI company based here in the city. We are dedicated toward providing universities with a generative AI system that is under their control. So, there are many ways to sort of start talking about this. One of them is, well, the reality that obviously, as we all very well know, AI is here to stay, right? We saw earlier today that famous sort of New Yorker article about how the students are using AI to cheat and all of that stuff, and sure, right? So now our sort of practical conversation is not about whether we get rid of AI or AI stays. It's more like, okay, well, if it's gonna stay, which it is, then how can we own this, right? And how can we not be subservient to what OpenAI determines or what Gemini determines? Or, how can we be in a position where we can sort of take advantage of, well, the available underlying motors that are out there, let's say from, of course, OpenAI, Meta, Anthropic, Google, etc., but in a position where the university, from the administrators to the faculty to the advisors, are not overrun by this, right, but rather have a degree of ownership, right, that is, well, commensurate with the fact that students are in a new challenge where they cannot be, on one hand, completely unprepared for the world out there that is going to expect them to not only have the foundational knowledge, but also to use generative AI for efficiency, right? And on the other hand, well, to maintain that ability for critical thinking and so on. And the faculty and the professors and the universities are, we would propose basically in the best position to sort of address this. Okay, so we want to say AI needs to go from something that is overrunning us and overrunning the universities and the faculty, making everybody very stressed out, to something that we can take advantage to accelerate in terms of the objectives that we have. Okay, so for instance, and we're going to talk about maybe a couple of cases, right? So from a student standpoint, well, I have to know generative AI. Okay, I have to know how to use it. It's going to be expected of me in the workforce. So how can I let's say have this as a native system that's available to me, right? So if I have, let's say, the Spain phase in the 1500s, right? So if I have this tooling, right, directly available within the learning systems and the infrastructure that is available to us, and I can reference sources, then I can use AI, assuming that I don't want to just cheat, okay? Like we really can't be just focused on, students want to cheat and how do we prevent them from cheating. That is not really sort of the way to lead this forward, right? Let's say that the students are motivated, right? And if you're like, okay, well, the students are not motivated, well, then how do we help the students be motivated, right? But if we start with the students who are motivated, and you say, okay, I have to learn the material, and having a tool, for instance, right, that gives me the sources where the data is found is an objectively helpful thing, right? If I have, for example, a learning management system, right, and I have my co-pilot on the side, okay, well, maybe I couldn't afford a private tutor, right, because where I came from, right, maybe I came from a place where that was just not a possibility, but now I have, if we turn this around, access to possibly the most democratizing thing ever in history in terms of information retrieval. It doesn't matter how, what access to what tutors you had before, you have access to the same language models as like Sam Altman, okay? So from a student standpoint, how can we say, okay, if I want to learn, and this convenience does help me in the same way that going to Google helps me not go to the library, right? And having a conversational interface over documents is not a replacement for that knowledge, it's just a way to easily access that information. Okay, well then that's cool. Now, from an instructor standpoint, well, I have my students, right, who are, well, on ChatGPT, and I have no idea what they're doing, okay? They are right there, I don't know what they're asking, but instead of that, I'm gonna be in a place where I can upload, let's say, my own data sets, okay? I'm going to be able to have history tracking for my students, for my analytics. I'm going to be able to see, well, how are my students doing? What are the topics that they're asking about? Okay, I'm going to have access to information that I don't have access to if my students are just on ChatGPT. So how can we turn this around and say, okay, instead of faculty being worried about banning ChatGPT, for instance, it's like, well, how can you say that, like, how can you have access to information that about what your students are struggling with? Okay, because if you know what questions the students are struggling with, well, then you have an opportunity to tailor that learning material over to the students. They say, okay, so I thought this was clear for my lectures, or I thought this was clear for students in general, but I see that they're asking about this, so how can I tailor my teaching toward that? Okay, I changed the conversation from how do I prevent my students from going on ChatGPT, right? Instead, now I change it to, okay, well, what are my students asking, and how can I use tooling that allows me to influence that pedagogy? Okay, because at the end of the day, neither, OpenAI, nor Google, nor us, nor anybody, AI is going to care about the student at an individual level more. Okay, so we want to turn this around from being overrun by the AI to being with an AI that we have at least more insight and more control over. Okay, because ChatGPT, the LLM, Altman, Zuckerberg, nobody really is going to care about that individual student as much as you wish. So this is going to be an opportunity to sort of turn this around and say, okay, if I can know, let's say if I'm in a lecture hall like this and I'm delivering a lecture and my students are having questions that maybe sometimes they're too shy to ask, okay, sometimes it's very embarrassing, right, to ask a question in front of everybody else, but I can track that individual, that individual's learning analytics and those lessons, well, then I can see how to, tailor my studies toward this. So this is, for instance, let's see, okay, I can track my students' chat history and I can see, and I'm assuming that of course they want to, okay, and we'll talk about the data ownership and so on, because that's a whole other area, but assuming that the students are, interacting, right, with, let's say, the systems, well, then maybe it is helpful for me to condense their messages, right, into, well, this is their knowledge gaps, this is what they've learned. I can see the profile for a student overall and say, okay, well, over the course of this student's history with me, what have they, what have been the takeaways, okay? Now, you try to see before generative AI as faculty, where can you get this information? It's like, well, I don't know, you can have one-on-one sessions with the students if and when that's ever possible, and obviously the greater the class size, the less possible that is. So, there is some positivity here. Okay, so from the faculty standpoint, instead of being, so, well, my students are in a system that is external, that I don't control, that I don't have access to, and so on, I can turn this around and say, if I really care about my students, of course, learning and being equipped to succeed in a world that, we just had graduations here, right, where students are going to be graduating, and increasingly the job of junior employees is going to be performed by language models. Okay, and this is changing increasingly, right? And we'll see a couple months from now, or a few months from now, that expertise level will increase. So now you do have more of a duty to educate that student further. And in a way, that job just got a lot more challenging, not because people are cheating, but because you have to prepare students to sort of think critically, right? And use these tools to radically increase their efficiency, yes, but while also retaining that thought. So, Christelle, for example, what you were talking about in terms of the vibe coding, right? That is excellent, right? Vibe coding is extremely important because you can radically increase the efficiency with which you create, right? You no longer have a massive paywall, which is, let's say, the software engineering job market for anybody who wants to get an idea done. Okay, that's great, but at the same time, after you've, let's say, vibe coded a system, you have to wonder, it's like, okay, well, how is this going to look like in terms of the security, in terms of the scalability, and so on? And you're like, okay, well, these are pointed problems. A year from now, they won't be there. Well, yes, but increasingly, that last mile of work, it's not like you can say, oh, well, this platform works correctly 95% of the time, and the other 5% there are, minor data leaks. It's like that's not really something that's possible, right? So You want to be able to educate your students to vibe code, but also have the ability to understand kind of what is going on. So the job of the faculty is no longer, I mean, obviously it's no longer just, okay, well, teaching to the test, right? Or I can take my assignments from years ago and now I'm going to recycle them. The student is going to take that, copy paste it into ChatGPT. You don't even have to really copy paste because you can install an operator and it can just directly work within your browser. The job of the faculty now it's more difficult, right? Is to say, okay, if I look at these students and I am responsible for their learning outcomes and their preparedness when they graduate, and this is what's great about City Tech, right? It's you have a practicality in terms of the students' careers and the students' knowledge that is honestly very admirable. So if that is the job of the faculty, to prepare the students to succeed, right, in the job market that is so insane, well, that ability to dive more deeply into your student just got even more important. Okay, so we have some challenges. Let's say from the students, you do have to compete with a workforce that is, of course, global, right? Of course, accelerated by generative AI. If you are not accelerated by that, then it's going to be a problem. From a faculty, you are helping your students in this manner, and you say, okay, well, what can actually help with this problem? And you say, well, generative AI, right? Generative AI properly used can serve as this accelerator, this democratizing force. So now we escalate a little bit, right? And we say, okay, well, how is that going to be a possibility, right? And this is now in the hands of the university's administrators. Okay, so now the university's administrators say, my students have this problem, my faculty has this problem, everybody in between, TAs, right, have this problem, academic advising, student advising, and from the university standpoint, you look out there and you say, well, what are my options here? Okay, well, on one hand, there is the obvious, well, ChatGPT. It's like, okay, well, that is very weird from a student privacy standpoint. I cannot just have my student data that throws FERPA and everything out the window, so I cannot really have a complete loss of control over here. Also, who is seeing that, who is knowing about my students? I'm just providing the buildings, and the entire instruction of this is being handed over to a nonprofit / for-profit company that is maybe doing things that I don't agree with at all. So, okay, well, I don't know, maybe just sending my students over to ChatGPT is not really a great option. Okay, well, what's another option? Gemini, Google. Okay, we love Google, right? We're great partners of Google. But from a university standpoint, you say, okay, well, you're just going to delegate your instruction, one of the most important things, and the student success, over to a company that is, beholden by shareholders that maybe have slightly different incentives. Like, why would that be good? It's like, okay, well, let's turn it over to Meta, right, to Zuckerberg. So, well, we can go down the line and make a case as to why being totally locked into any one of these parties is maybe just not the smartest move. Okay, and never mind about being the smartest, it's also not really politically expedient, right? You have your faculty, right? These, amazing people that you've been building over the years, and now you say, okay, well, you don't really matter. Now you're handing over the students over to these tools. And if you don't do this, then your students are, probably going to be in a little bit of trouble, right? Because unless they can make your, TA's office hours at 3 p.m. on Thursday, hopefully they don't work then, right? Then, good luck to them. So it's not really a great situation overall. Now, from the university's administrator, then they say, okay, well, if I can sell people, right, on my faculty and my students on, let's say, these kinds of tools, these kinds of external tools, then I have to deal with the pricing challenges. Okay, well, that's another story, right? So ChatGPT, $20 per user per month. Okay, well, that gets real expensive, right? And that gets real expensive, especially, the more students that you have. You just say bachelors and associates and so on, not even talking about the continuing education, that gets very expensive, but also doesn't really take advantage of the fact that these language models are being commoditized at large, right, by each other, right? Open source obviously is, playing a huge role, but OpenAI does not have a moat in this, and neither does Google, neither does Meta or Anthropic or whatever. They're all competing with each other, right? It's an arms race. So why would you say, okay, well, I'm going to be saying that the most reasonable option is for me to pay $20 per user per month, right, for thousands of students, and I don't really have that ability to take advantage of, Well, the fact that these things are commoditized. And if these things are commoditized, then you should be able to hop around from one language model to another instead of just being locked into one. Okay? Because it's critically important that you provide this service to your students and to your faculty. And if your only choice is going to be to do something that is financially very challenging, especially considering what we heard today about the population bombs and then the whole sort of, defunding and all this kind of thing, then you really want to retain a position where you can have some control over the prices. And this is an interesting thing where if you look at, these companies, you see, okay, well, they quoted me $20 per user per month, right, at the university level, but from a developer standpoint, they're competing at an API level. Okay, so on one hand, they're trying to appeal to me as an administrator by saying $20 per user per month, but then they're going to a community of developers and they're saying, well, the price is 40 cents per million tokens. It's like, okay, so what is the difference? Okay, well, why am I being quoted $20 per user per month if the price that is being quoted at the API level is 40 cents, right, per million tokens? And you can likewise, go to Google and to everybody else, and you can see that there's a real advantage, okay, Google, for example, right, for Gemini 2.5 Flash, 15 cents, okay, per million tokens. This is great, okay? So why would the university say, well, I'm just going to do $20 per user per month. I'm going to be effectively entering into a very financially tough agreement where I can instead take advantage of the fact that these LLMs are being commoditized. For our purposes, they are, right? Maybe societally, right, there is no AGI yet, but for our purposes of, Socratic instruction, right, it's actually quite good. What's it? Well, what is happening is that people are, and these companies and so on, backed by VC pressures and all this kind of stuff, right, but taking advantage a little bit of the fact that the university cannot have any other option because they cannot build their own applications, they cannot call these APIs, okay? And it's a little bit harsh, right? Because they say, okay, well, you're gonna pay this much, potentially putting yourself in a very difficult situation financially because you cannot build your own application, okay? And you cannot build your own application. Well, one is because maybe you don't have the IT resources. Everybody that you have is already very busy, and you can't just be like, hey, build this entire new system from scratch. So what happens is, from a university standpoint, well, you really are left with a pretty crappy choice, right? You say, okay, well, either my students or my faculty are not going to have this, or I'm going to have to build something that I don't really have, let's say, the development cycles or the capacity to build at the very moment, or really that's it. So now what we are proposing and what we're seeing here, and we see cases with, for example, partners of ours like Syracuse University, Fordham, et cetera, is to say, okay, you know what? LLM companies and generative AI companies, I'm actually going to own an application layer myself, okay? I'm going to have the ability to call these APIs myself, okay? And that is going to take me out of the little pricing chokehold that you're otherwise trying to place me in. And by owning these applications, and owning this application doesn't mean there are some very friendly terms of service. It literally means let's have my code and my data running in my servers, okay? I don't want to trust anybody who are, basically companies that are disguised data collection agencies, okay? They're like, oh, for education, but no, that's very weird. I'm not going to be forking over my data to people I don't know. Instead, I'm going to be saying, I need to own this myself. I need to have the access to the code myself. I need to be able to really call the shots and take advantage of what the rest of the world, sometimes education and healthcare, are a little bit behind as industries, right, compared to others. But when you look at the impact of open source across others, you say, okay, well, this actually really helps in terms of bringing prices down and increasing access. So we're going to do the same thing for education and for the universities. And that is basically the world that we are in, right? It's basically creating sort of partnerships with universities, one at a time, and saying, okay, well, if you do find a need, right, in implementing generative AI safely, right, for the students, for the faculty, and so on, and when we say safely, it means, it's like, okay, well, what does safely mean? It's not, I'm an engineer, okay, and I'm not a pedagogist, and I don't, I think I kind of know my place to say that my best role is to build or to have a tool that a, professor is able to to use to enter their own definitions of safety and of moderation, okay? So if we have a system and a world that faculty can be using to control their prompts and their moderation and their safety according to their own definitions, well, then we are in a much different place. At the administrator level, well, you can also say that if I have access to a tool that is maybe running within my organization, within my cloud, frankly, then I have the ability to tap into data sources that are otherwise siloed from each other, right? So we have our friend Jose Diaz, right, from City Tech says, well, in a university, you often see that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. These are two departments, different data. They don't really talk to each other, right? Because, not any reason, they don't even know what the other person knows, so there's just no way for this communication to happen. Well, if you own a system that does not make you worry about, well, I don't know, you're not going to be forking over all of your enrollment and your registrar data to, an external entity, then you can basically bridge those gaps. And this is what the point of generative AI is, from a university standpoint, is to facilitate access to information and to data, right? And when it comes to the students, well, that means that I have access to the same tutor as, Elon Musk's kid, okay? I have, from a faculty standpoint, insight into my students that I did not have before. I didn't know what the shy student who didn't raise their hand was thinking or what they were struggling with. Okay, well, now I know that. And from an administrator standpoint, it means if I need to have insights that maybe allow me to allocate resources in order to help my student population a little bit better, well, then a silo effectively is removed, okay? And this is really the whole point, right? So generative AI, on one hand, is, of course, there's a lot of pressure, right? This is improving at a massive pace. I mean, all of these are obvious things that everybody agrees with, but there is a flip side where you say, okay, well, instead of being overrun by this, I'm going to be in a position where I can take a little bit more ownership. And if I don't define my job and my role by what I do, but rather than by what my mission is, right? Like the faculty's job is not to grade essays, it's to educate the students. Okay, so grading essays, that can be automated for all we care. That's not really the fundamental job. So if you zoom out and you say, okay, well, this is what my mission is, and now I have a legion of helpers, in a way, then that's interesting. Okay, so this is the entire sort of crux of this, right? Is from a university standpoint, how can we have a level of ownership that is otherwise not available? And if it is available, some people try to conceal it, right? Sometimes for profit motives, sometimes for other reasons. So that's what we're seeing. So when you have the ability to create, for instance, any sort of, let's say you say for a university, well, I need to have agents and, mentors, agents, chatbots, these things are all synonymous, right? But for a variety of methods, right? So one could be, well, tutoring, and tutoring is the lowest hanging fruit. Like, why not say, okay, well, for each professor, I'm going to be able to load in my notes, and my students are going to be able to ask questions anytime. Okay? You're basically providing a text interface over a data set of PDFs. It's not, is it replacing instruction? No, it's really just answering that. As we have, one friend of ours from the George Washington University, he's like, I did not become a professor, so I could answer questions about the syllabus. I'm not really threatened by students asking me about the syllabus. Okay, cool. Then you say, okay, well, for tutoring, if we are able to give everybody a little bit of, not to overemphasize it, but a little bit of a tutor, which is a way to ask questions and get answers in real time, then that's helpful. From a faculty standpoint, well, I'm going to have a system that is, directly within my LMS, okay? And it doesn't really matter what the LMS is, but I'm gonna have that kind of convenience. It's like, well, not really threatening either. From, let's say, from a prospective student standpoint, okay, if I have, let's say a student comes into your site and a student has some questions about the university, maybe they're thinking about enrolling, or maybe they're already enrolled and they want to see some information about it, there's really nothing harmful about having a little agent over there that sort of puts a text interface over that data, right? So there's a lot of good, as long as we don't have to really sell our soul in order to achieve that good. Okay, selling our soul, okay, entering into financial agreements that are going to be a problem, or giving people access to all of my data that make me completely irrelevant, or causing harmful effects for the students because I really don't know what's going on. As long as we can have, like in programming, right, try catch blocks for this kind of stuff, then, we are in a good place. So this is the, this is the point of the talk here, right, is to say, okay, well, from a generative AI standpoint, there is a bright narrative, right, especially for universities, to have ownership over systems versus sort of the existing mainstream alternatives. And yeah, so now, wanted to ask you if you have any questions. We have like 10 minutes, 9 minutes, and yeah. Yes.
What you mentioned about ownership, right? And thinking how CityTech can adopt that idea. So you mentioned also privacy concerns, right? And that's one of the issues, right? So we don't want to put students' information on a public site, right? So, but what I don't understand quite well is how your company, your tools help the university not to do that. Like, for example, if we still use the API version, still the information goes to the LLM on OpenAI, right? So are you tapping to open source LLMs installed locally, or is that what you are mentioning here?
Okay. Oh yeah. So that's okay. So perfect question. So the way to guarantee that ownership without, trust me, bro, is this application runs in your infrastructure. It runs in your, whether it's GCP, in your Google systems, or Amazon, or Azure, or any system, it has to run in your servers. The same as the web application that powers your registrar, right? And the same as the application that powers the student success systems. Everything that is in your servers. So this application runs there. The same cloud contracts govern your generative AI application as what they govern the registrar and whatever. Now, with the language models, because there is a difference between the application layer and the language model. Like the language model is, you can plug into external ones. And you could say, okay, well, if I plug into OpenAI's, I may be holding the application, so I have ownership over that data, but when it's time to ask questions, I'm sending that over to OpenAI, and that you're right. In that case, you do have to trust OpenAI, but the good news is that you can also have LLMs, as all the major cloud providers do, that are governed by your existing cloud contracts within your cloud infrastructure. So Google, for example, has Vertex AI, right? They have a model garden. In that model garden, they have models that are running on-premise that have the same level of ownership as, let's say, the registrar, because that LLM is running on GPUs that are in the same network as the applications that you trust. So in terms of the LLM, which is kind of like the brain of these agents, you have a lot of options to say, of course, open source, right? So, you have the Blackwell, the Blackwell hardware here and so on, but you can also, because you want to take advantage of sort of price per use, price per use and all of that, within your existing cloud systems, right? So Google has the model garden running within your infrastructure. Amazon has Bedrock. Microsoft has the same thing. So there are tools, and you can even push this further. So the other day, for example, with Yale University, and they're saying, okay, well, what if I am concerned about greater trends? For example, the impact of AI on the climate, right, and on global warming. It's like, okay, well, you can have models that are running within your computers and within your phones. And you say, well, how good are those models going to be? Well, a lot better than they were 2 years ago, right? And increasingly much, much better. You have mean, there's hardware like the MPUs and so on, where you can be running these models locally as in your hardware, and then you definitely don't go anywhere else for this. So that data ownership, yeah, there are sometimes some of these some of these little tricks that sometimes, people will say that, okay, I'm supposed to own it, but I have to control the application layer, I have to control the database layer, and I can control the language model layer. And the good news is that's very feasible.
Thank you so much, Miguel.
Thank you. Awesome. Thank you.